behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with it.
You're killing me, man.
Hello and welcome to Declarations of War, EVE's longest-running podcast. I am Alexei Card, and joining me to discuss EVE, PvP, and politics with a mercenary perspective, my faithful co-host, former Nord director, Zero Cool.
Hello, hello.
Happy Halloween, everyone. Today's episode is extra spooky as we talk about the existential horror of the real world and the machine-like nature of our very own bodies and brains. Breaking with our normal format to go deeper into the psychology of PvP itself. Our special guest for this very special episode is neuroscientist and author of the book Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, Dr. Nicholas Wright. Nick, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get into this, I've got to thank our sponsor for today's episode, Master Reborn Technologies Incorporated. Is there anything more horrifying than working your real job? Do you not get enough of that feeling of existential dread and despair in your real life? Why not roleplay working for a faceless corporation in the game? MRTI is the corporation for you. In addition to this rather unique and soul-crushing potential experience of your online virtual life, they offer free ships, free cosmetics, skill plans, lucrative projects, and much, much more. If you've got an alt that you have no idea what to do with, why not put it in MRTI? They are recruiting today. Fun RP, no serious pressure. If you're interested, hit up Kenar on EVE, that is Kenaar, to see if MRTI has a cubicle for you. Salaries start at 100 million ISK per month with paid vacation and health benefits. There's a little asterisk here on the read. Health benefits not guaranteed. That's probably not important. We're going to move on. Thank you for our sponsors, Master Reborn Technologies Incorporated. Dr. Wright, thank you for joining us today. We would just love to start things off with a little bit about your background. Normally we ask people, how did you get into EVE the game? Mm-hmm. You've not got into EVE the game. You've done something far more productive with your life.
Well, that depends on your perspective, yeah.
Well, neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, you've touched a brain with your, possibly bare hands. I don't know. I'm not going to ask too many questions.
Well, yeah, not bare, you'll be pleased to hear, yeah.
How did you get into that? What made you passionate about the brain?
Yeah, so I was a doctor and I practiced medicine, treating patients with a range of different neurology problems in Oxford and in London. And I think, and this is one of the things that people talk about, with war. I mean, one of the, main things was, it sounds very cliche, but I wanted to help people. That's a big chunk of why I became a doctor. And just to say, I think in the same way, that's actually why a lot of people want to become military personnel, actually, is they want to be able to protect people. That's kind of why I went into medicine, but I've always been fascinated by the brain and our minds. I then spent a number of years using functional brain imaging. So that's things like MRI, but functional MRI and other brain scanning techniques to look at how humans make decisions about things like rewards and punishments and so on, risks. And I did that in the lab that DeepMind was spun out of, now Google DeepMind. A lot of the reasons why AI is so powerful now is the whole set of ideas about how the brain works that came out of neuroscience. So both last year's Nobel Prizes in AI, for example, were closely linked to my research institute in London, which is known as Queen Square. I always wanted to apply these ideas about the brain that we've discovering and apply those to things in the real world and really big problems, really big challenges. And so I then moved to Washington, DC, where I worked at one of the big think tanks looking at nuclear strategy, understanding how humans make decisions and applying that to thinking about nuclear strategy. And that's where I started working with the Pentagon Joint Staff. And I've been collaborating with them now for over 10 years. That's really what I do. So I work doing neuroscience research and also doing research with the Pentagon on applying our ideas about the brain to a wide variety of different real world challenges they face.
That is amazing. You're very familiar with the brain. Your book is kind of structured around various parts of it, how they influence our decisions. What is your favorite part of the brain? Just a broad question. But
do you know what?
If you had to drop one and get another of the other, what would you do?
I removed that from the book. But I did actually say that my favorite bit of the brain, because it was the very first bit of the brain that I did a brain imaging study of, is the occipitotemporal cortex, what some people in France call the visual word form area, which is an area that's very important for reading. But we were involved in a vicious debate. You know how the debates can be in science. Vicious debate about whether this area was specialized for reading or was specialized for object generation, object identification, rather, more generally. So I would say that little bit there of lateral occipitotemporal cortex. I'm very partial to it.
What side of that did you come down on?
I think that it's more general rather than specific for reading. But I think it does get... So basically, when we read, so our brain is very plastic, it can change. And when we learn to read, it changes how some of the inputs from the visual system are linked up with our language system in the brain, or systems that deal with language in the brain. And those do change as you learn to read. And I think that does happen. So I'm kind of, it's not specialized for reading, but it's very important with reading.
Now you hear that, France?
I like the French. It's not. Yeah, it's good, solid scientific debate. So in fact, the most famous, and if you want to read a book about military strategy, other than my book, obviously, one of the best books is Thomas Schelling, who wrote a book called Arms and Influence in the 1960s, and he won a Nobel Memorial Prize for his work. And the three. So he gives three sets of examples. He gives the historical examples, academic politics, which can get pretty brutal, and child rearing. Those are his three examples on his Nobel Prize-winning work on deterrence.
Well, a large portion of your book is framed around the concept of models, and I think it's probably going to come up in the next couple questions we ask you. So, just at the start, for our audience, what are models as they apply to your work and your book, and why are they so important to understanding how the brain processes decisions like war and conflict? Yeah,
so if you ask the question, why do you have a brain, right? Or why do I have a brain? Why does any listener to this have a brain? The reason why any of us have a brain is very simple. And that is, it's a process that helps link senses coming in, and then link those to actions that help us achieve our goals. That's what a model is, essentially. It's just a process that helps link senses to actions that help us achieve our goals. And you don't even need a brain to have that kind of model. So something like an amoeba, a single-celled organism, that can have a model that can link, senses, certain, chemicals around it into actions, moving in a particular direction to catch prey or get food or whatever. So that's kind of that's the basic idea of what a model is. It's something very simple. It's a very simple concept. And you could have a fruit fly, right? A fruit fly that can have a model of the world, or a little bird like a robin going around my garden, identifying, using its vision to identify bugs under the undergrowth, and then eating those, making actions to catch those, and so it achieves its goal of eating and then surviving over the winter. Because actually, about half of robins will die over the winter. It's a pretty brutal world for the robin redbreast that it lives in my garden. And so our brain obviously can do a lot more than the brains of many other types of animals. And so what we have is actually not just one single model, but a whole orchestra of different models in our brain. And that's what the book does. So it starts off looking just down at the brain stem, right at the very base of the brain. And then it moves up through the brain, through lots of different areas of the brain, through areas that deal with fear, for example, or where we are in the world, and all the way up through finally to our models we have that enable us to look at ourselves, to think about our own thinking. And that happens, a crucial area of that is right at the very other end of the brain, the frontal polar bit, just behind your forehead. And that part of the brain can use models, or can use a model of yourself So it can think about your own thinking so that you can make better decisions and understand better what's going on in the world. And so that's what I mean by models. And a lot of these models can actually be very sophisticated. So I know that you're in a computer game, or like a lot of what you're doing is a computer game, a simulation. Well, in many ways, that's what our models are. So to give you an example, these models aren't just a metaphor. They're literally in our brains. So to give you a really tangible example, you right now, you have a model of space. Okay, you have a model of space, a model of the room you're in, a model of the house you're in, a model of the area you're in, a model of space, a map of space. And in rodents, for example, we can put a grid of electrodes in an area of their brain called the hippocampal entorhinal cortex. And then, just by reading out which neurons, which brain cells are active in their map, we can read out where they are really in the physical world. Okay, so these models of the world are really in there. They're really existing things within our brains, and they simulate the world, and they help us act in the world to achieve our goals.
So you're saying that even brainless entities like players in Test Alliance, please ignore, they have these models.
I don't know what that is.
That's an in-joke for
I'm sorry.
players.
I mean, this is the thing. The brain is incredibly complex, like 86 billion brain cells. It's enormously complex. So I think it's good to try and get an idea of what it is the brain does. And the idea of this model is really central to how modern neuroscience works. And that just helps take what's very complex and make it simple to understand. And then our brain actually uses lots of those models like an orchestra of models to understand the world and react in the way we need to survive.
You've touched on that we can, some of these models are perhaps changeable over time, that we can think about our thinking, but it also feels like a lot of our models are quite deeply ingrained. How hardwired are our brains for conflict in particular? So
I think that as you travel through the brain, starting at the brainstem and then going through many different brain areas in the book, all the way through to the frontal pole at the other end, there isn't one simple reason that drives us towards war. But unfortunately, there are many reasons, many aspects of our brains that drive us towards conflict. So to give you an example, fear, right? We need fear. If you don't have fear, if you lack the amygdala, it's a very rare thing, but there's a little area of the brain that's very important for fear. And sometimes there are very rare patients where they lose this amygdala, this little part of the brain that's really crucial for fear. And so what happens if you don't have fear? If you don't have fear, it's not like you become a fearless criminal who can take whatever you want without worrying about the consequences. That's not what happens. If you don't have these brain regions that are crucial for fear, then what actually happens if you're living in a not particularly pleasant environment is that you actually become a victim of crime. And so there's a very famous patient who's been studied a lot by researchers at Caltech, and this lady becomes a victim of crime. So we need fear. Fear is useful, right? It sounds counterintuitive, but fear is useful. On the other hand, obviously fear can, when multiple groups of people fear each other, that can drive us towards war. The same thing with, social motivations like rejecting unfairness or injustice, that can help us stand up for things that are important in life and yet stand up for ourselves. And yet, on the other hand, when two groups of people both feel the other side is treating them unjustly and they have too exclusive an idea of injustice, then you have a tragedy. Right, tragedy there, not of right versus wrong, but of two groups who both believe themselves to be right. Misperceptions and misunderstandings is another reason that can drive us towards war. And that's just, a feature of how our brains work, And then there will always be a proportion of people who deliberately want to start wars. There will always be new Hitlers. There will always be new Osama bin Ladens. There will always be new Vladimir Putins. And that will always be part of what it is to be human. But I really want to say that although that's part of what we are as humans, as humanity, that's not all we are. And I'm actually really optimistic because I think if we can understand our brains better, if we can understand why we fight, then we can reduce the chances we'll go to war and we'll reduce the chance of war escalating. And we can also, if we understand how the human brain works, then if we do need to fight, then we can fight more effectively and we can win wars if we must fight them.
I think that brings us neatly on to a point I wanted to bring to any listener of this podcast's attention that isn't perhaps from one side or the other, or perhaps is listening from this perspective of cognition around war and doesn't know much about EVE Online. In reading your book, Dr. Wright, I was struck by how much it confirms something I already suspected, that our little game EVE Online really does mimic a lot of our real world in terms of the history and the culture and the warfare. So just to sort of outline some of that for you now, really. EVE's been going on for over 20 years, and it's been a perpetual existence. We've had a start point in 2003, and the history started then. And everybody who was playing then, some of those people are still around and some are not. Everybody who did play then, you know, is in our history, right? Everything they did is within our history. And there's this sort of a history book of sorts that's been written.
There's
and in fact, there's three. Right? Yeah, there is a third now, isn't it, coming up? There is a history book about the warfare, the early wars in EVE and some of the others. Now, it's a global player base, right? Everybody plays in one place at one time across thousands of different systems. So there's a geography within the game. But everybody is playing the same game at the same time. When we all log into the game, we're all logging into the same server. And that means that, you know, language barriers exist, time zone issues exist, and the geography, you know, in some way mimics the real world. You know, we have everybody, for example, who exists in the Central Asian time zone. They are very unified in the gameplay. Most of the players play for the same team, if you want, and as a result, they're able to have significant political and sort of war structured influence. And then to just sort of skim over some of the highlights of this, what has resulted from all of this, right? We've got tons of examples of things like unexpected victories, you know, against seemingly much stronger or more prepared opponents. Groups have collapsed due to a failure of will rather than a competence or you know, resources. We've had groups with extraordinary resolve and resilience surviving after months of conflict against all odds in a final stand outnumbered type scenario. That's happened multiple times. We've got superpowers and alliances, neutral states fighting this long-term war over territories and resources. And injustice has really been a strong motivator for some serious all-out war and outrage within the history of the game.
Particularly recently.
Yes. And then to top that off, you know, that's the war. Not all players really care about this fighting stuff. A lot of players play the game because that's how they interact with their friends online, or because they enjoy building things, or because they enjoy playing the stock market, if such a thing were to exist in EVE. There's an economy there. There's, you know, there's friendship groups and all sorts of other things. People move things around for each other. There's, you know, city kind of populations and stuff. So there's all of this sort of non-war related population going on that, it gets affected. Now, to finish that off, then we've got this sort of, why does it mimic it, I think, is the question I was trying to answer, right? And I think the similarities that I draw from your book, people who play EVE, I'm not going to tell you how the game works, obviously, but I'm going to tell you that if you play EVE Online, there's a few sort of vital drives, you might call them, that you're driven towards. You know, you need to make a little bit of money in the game, and that means you need to go out there and do stuff similar to sort of hunting sort of mechanics in some way, you know, for food, you know, in a sense. There's no food in the game, but it's that kind of drive. And also people are driven towards, you know, some sort of like progression within their own gameplay. So they're trying to improve their lot, or they, you know, perhaps trying to create some sort of safe haven for themselves or their friends, that sort of thing. And then the warfare that happens in EVE tends to happen over longer periods. It tends to be driven by inflicting prediction errors, I think you would call them, on the population. So if you're playing the game as you normally would, suddenly the opponent might come along and disrupt your activities and make it a hostile environment for you, and cause you to, well, become very scared of your environment all of a sudden, isn't it? And cause your model to be broken down and you know, cause conflict within groups then, because people are starting to ask questions about why aren't we protected by our overlords and things like that. And some people sort of turtle up, as we say, and hide. Others have a drive to fight back. And in those people, we see emerging military leaders, and we end up, those people command large armies in the end. But otherwise, the other things that happen, propaganda is a big thing in EVE Online. Propaganda is used to influence, the narrative. It's done outside of the game a lot. It's done in like other places on the internet, or things like podcasts and things, and or books that get written, or videos that get made on the internet. And some groups, obviously, or most groups actually, they sanitize the news and provide what we might call copium to their masses. They give them, the political spin on events to enable them to continue going on, isn't it? And then the last point I want to make then is, and this is a really strong one, right? You wouldn't believe how detailed it can be. In EVE Online, it's all about statistics and things. So there's a lot of after-action reports, they call it. It's basically, organized metacognition. People thinking about, how did we die in this scenario? What were we thinking at the time? How can we think differently in the future? People really spend a lot of time analyzing their own thoughts within, from a sort of, what happened last week, what happened last year, what happened 3 years ago, and really trying to figure out as a group, how can we improve this? So I'll stop talking there, but those are the sort of the main points, I think, that really drive why we see similarities between the real world and the online world.
Is your question, why are there such similarities?
My intent here is to outline for you what the similarities are.
That is really striking. I mean, it also makes me, one of the things to say, so if you were to, for example, so I've conducted experiments, so I do sort of, cognitive experiments and so on, and I've published academic papers looking at people in Britain and also at my university in London, and also at in America at New York University, and in China and in Iran, actually, looking at how people make decisions across all those different areas. And then I've also done other research for the Pentagon, where I've looked at lots of different studies that have been done comparing lots of different cultures. And one of the things is that actually our brains are much more similar across all these different places. The commonalities are much greater across cultures than the differences. Yes, there are differences between cultures in the way we think and so on, but actually the commonalities are much greater. And I think it was genuinely interesting listening to you speaking like that. And in a way, it sounds very much like, you have created a culture, a civilization, just as, for example, the Aztecs created a civilization in, Mesoamerica, which was obviously completely geographically divorced from, the Middle Eastern related civilizations that sprang up around sort of, ancient Sumer and so on. And in a way, you've kind of created your own civilization, obviously linked in, but quite distinct. With your own geography and so on. So, and so it's not surprising in a way that so many of these different things occur in your world, as it were, because they kind of occur in all human worlds, because they arise from human brains. So it's really fascinating hearing all of that.
So we've drawn a comparison there between, our game as a sort of micro civilization of its own, isn't it? It's very much outside of our real world, but obviously created by humans, therefore mimics it. To what extent, has science found the answer to questions around, simulated conflict and violence? Okay, and how does the brain explain or find solutions around, say, violence in video games, right? That's a subject that's been really studied heavily. I don't want to. I'll let you talk about it, actually, really, before I go.
So I think that and this comes back to a crucial point that one of the points you made, that not all players are interested in the war part of it, and in fact that the conflict is only one part of what we are. Now, obviously, I literally wrote a book called Warhead. So clearly I think it's an important part. And I think right now we need to know about it more, because we're living in a dangerous time, and we need to think about it, because there is just a lot more war occurring in the world now, and a lot more war brewing, and we need to start thinking about that. But that is still only one part of us. It's very important to remember that there are many other parts of what there's so much more to us as well. We mustn't forget that conflict is part of us and part of what it is to be human, but there's so much more as well. You talk there about, how can we think about reconciliation, for example, or I might say, how can we think about reconciliation? So it's really important to remember that, yes, humans are, conflict is part of us, but reconciliation is every single bit as natural as conflict. So to give you an example, even, people who are, fully seized of the importance of standing up to Adolf Hitler before World War II, right? And I know this is the whole thing about the internet, talking about Adolf Hitler, but I literally did just write a book in which I have a major theme is World War II. So I think I'm probably allowed to say this on the internet. But like Winston Churchill, for example, if you read his history that he wrote of World War II, this is his big multi-volume history that he wrote of World War II, right at the very beginning, at the very, very beginning, like one of the key morals for him is in victory, magnanimity, right? So you've got to be, you've got to reconcile. And so, for example, after World War II, yes, military victory was necessary in World War II to defeat Nazi Germany. I don't know if you've ever been to Berlin, but you can go to where Hitler's bunker was, and literally the Soviet Russian troops were literally just like round the corner. And that it was only when they were literally that close that Hitler, committed suicide, and that was the end of the Third Reich. They fought on incredibly hard. We needed to defeat them militarily, and that required an enormous amount of skill and, will to fight, all of those things you talked about. But the thing is after World War II, military victory wasn't sufficient. It was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. We also were very careful about reconciling. Reconciliation is natural, every bit as natural as conflict.
I mentioned a little bit about vital drives, the link there. That, as a game player of the game, you kind of have to engage in the game to be having fun and doing something with your time. Yeah. And one of the main things that we all do with each other's opponent, with opponents and people you're trying to affect in the game, is you deny the other players access to their vital drives, right? You try to stop them from being able to go out and make money. You try to stop them from moving their things around. You try to stop them from basically having fun in the game, right? Sadly, that's what it's about. And it works incredibly well. It causes people to have like political meltdowns in massive organizations within the game, and thousands of people will be arguing with each other over silly things like this. Are there any real world sort of examples of that level of pettiness? I imagine that there are, right? I'm not talking here about necessarily denying your opponent access to food and water, because obviously, as your book explains, staying alive it trumps even the vital drives, right? But I'm talking more about, in the real world, examples of warfare where the opponent has been prevented from socializing with each other, from having relationships with each other, from the fun stuff, and that having such a major impact on the population.
That is a really, that's a great question. So I think you're right. I think we have to distinguish between vital drives. So I mean, for example, if you think about Ukraine, there were Ukrainian soldiers who were in the Azovstal steel plant, and they were they had to drink the brine of pickles to survive, because there was no water left. But I think you're right in terms of social connection. There are so many different types of social connection. So two answers. So the first thing is that things that seem really important to us, that could have seemed really important, during World War II, where people literally had not enough food to eat, not enough water to drink, and so on. But now, of course, we don't have any of those issues. But the thing is, the way the human brain works is that we now find the things that people do worry about. So things like how many likes they have on Instagram or whatever it might be, that then is magnified within the brain. So we then find new things to worry about. And that's especially the case because each new generation, each new generation has their new brains, and what they inherit is the sort of status quo. So, so there was a medieval Arab philosopher called Ibn Khaldun, and he described how empires rose and fall in 3 generations. The first generation was hungry and keen, and it built the empire. The second generation could see what their parents had created, so they would be able to keep the empire going. And the third generation were palace-suckled princelings who didn't have the grit to keep things going. And I think to some extent that's what we've become in our societies now. we're bored with the status quo. By any objective standards, like somewhere like America or Britain is, for almost everybody, one of the nicest bits of history there's ever been to live in. And so therefore, what we now worry about is what is for the majority of human history would have been utter trivia. So I think that's perhaps even an example of what you were talking about, is that we worry about things now that people would not have worried about, in most parts of human history. But then in terms of how people specifically used, so what types of relationships do we have? So we have relationships with people of the opposite sex, for example, or sexual relationships. And those sexual relationships have always been used as a source of power. If you look anywhere in the Middle East, for example, sex has always been critical. One of the key things about the Islamic Republic of Iran is they have very different attitudes and it was a key area of grievance and so on, compared to the pre-Islamic republic's regime, of controlling women in certain ways and how sexual relations should occur and so on. So those types of things have always been controlled, and people care deeply about that type of thing. And then more broadly, culture. I'm trying to think of where they've denied people culture. Culture can be hugely powerful. I'm trying to think I'll have a think about where people have denied people other than things like solitary confinement and so on, where they've denied people culture. Can I give you one other, this is a medical
Certainly.
example. We know, for example, that loneliness, so when you graph out, when you look at people's social networks, loneliness is a very good predictor of mortality. So loneliness is a significant predictor of mortality. There are lots of studies that have very consistently shown that. So the strength of your social networks, I think, does correlate, for example, there with mortality. I'm trying to think about, but yeah, this is a really great question. I'm gonna have to have a think about that and get some good historical examples for you.
Hopefully, EVE Online hasn't stumbled upon the missing ingredient here to total domination.
Well, I do have a bit of a question about that, in that, as Zero noted, there are multiple factors of EVE's virtual world which are quite different than ours. So there's no scarcity. There's no civilian population to need to be concerned about, at least not in the sense of collateral damage. There are non-combat players who you could sort of think of as a civilian population, but not in the sense of creating refugees or a humanitarian crisis and things like that. There's no permanent death. We lose things permanently, like our possessions permanently, but our existence cannot literally be ended. And neither can we end the existence of our opponents, even if we defeat them in a conflict. And finally, I think perhaps very importantly, there's a major ease of movement. Unlike the real world, where it can be extremely difficult to even move large distances within the same country, let alone in between countries or in between continents. It is relatively trivial to do that in the game, and also relatively trivial to switch your citizenship, quote unquote, your group of allegiance. How might those differences interact with the brain's concept of war and make it more or less likely?
I mean, I think your point about scarcity is a great one. So there's no sort of material scarcity in your world.
It's different. There are some materials where you can have limited quantities of it, but in general,
there's competition, but not. Beneath it, there's an infinite number of resources at the end of the day.
But then, for example, so where in human groups, where does leadership come from? So human groups naturally have leadership and followers, right? And there are leaders at many different levels within a group. So it's not like there's one leader and everyone else is a follower. There are many different levels of leadership, but there will always be leaders and followers. So why does that happen? And that's partly because there is a scarcity, for example, of prestige. So some people will be more prestigious, and there's not an infinite amount of prestige. So the first thing is that our human societies, the way we think about societies, there will be a social hierarchy within society. And there are areas of the brain that sort of track that sort of social hierarchy, and that's the case in many social species, not just in humans. But then also we have leaders. So leaders have power. They become leaders. There are two main sources of power that leaders have. So one is more classic, that would be seen in many animals. It's dominance, right? So I'm bigger and stronger. I can force you to do things, right? And you see this with like Vladimir Putin. I don't know if you saw before the invasion of Ukraine, there was a classic thing where Vladimir Putin was sitting in a giant room and he was sitting behind a desk, and then he had all like these key officials sitting far away in a row, and he basically interrogates like, I'm in charge and you're not in charge. You know, it's like I'm the guy here. I am the dominant one.
Mm-hmm.
So there's dominance, but there's also prestige. So prestige is that you like we humans, we're really, really, really dependent on learning from others, right? Learning and teaching. Without learning and teaching, we humans would literally just, and not in your game, but like in the real world, we would just die. You know, Victorian explorers from places like Britain or America would go, and then they would just die in some place surrounded by foodstuffs where the local people knew how to access them, and they didn't, right? Because they didn't know how to do it. We humans rely on learning and teaching to operate in the world. And so prestige is so important because there are some people, some teachers who we look up to because they have things to teach us, right? They are good teachers. And so that's another incredibly powerful, they have expertise. That's another incredibly powerful source of power that leaders have, which is prestige. And that could be military prestige, as military experts, as great generals, or whatever. And so that will be scarce. And so one thing I would just say is that I think there will always, like we humans, there will always be scarcity for us in a variety of things. So, you know, whatever the material components are. And that can always lead to competition, and it can always then lead to, you know, violent, competition that can get out of hand and become violent.
Certainly does parallel with, you know, the game we play. Often that prestige of knowledge and ability is what we see. So sometimes it's about military ability, but sometimes it's just about knowledge of other things within the game. It's such a crazy and detailed world that there are experts in everything. And there's certainly a competition among experts as well.
I think there's a vital drive we have that is somewhat novel in that because the risk of death isn't there, there's really no fear of fighting, or it's very muted. And we see oftentimes conflict over boredom, the need to initiate some novel situation, something new, get things stirring, or come up with a reason to get your followers excited to fight. Sometimes that pretense can be quite flimsy.
Yeah, but then, I mean, that's politics. I remember a while ago, I had you can watch it on the internet, I think, probably somewhere. I held a meeting with two British parliamentarians. So, you know, one from the Labour Party and one from the Conservative Party, and two members of the US Congress, one Democrat, one Republican. And, you know, at one point, one of these four politicians, this was on Zoom, and they had a baby, right? A baby came on screen. And then all four politicians like, oh, it's a baby. And, you know, they did their whole, you know, it's literally a baby. They're baby kissing politicians. That's their thing. But I always think when, like, complaining about politicians being like politicians is like complaining about water being wet. You know, I mean, they are politicians. If a baby appears on screen, they have to look like they like babies. That's literally their job.
Could you imagine the alternative?
Yeah, I mean,
Get that thing out
they
of
just
here.
wouldn't be successful politicians. Just
Right.
like, I mean, if you have these leaders and they didn't try and stir stuff up and make things interesting and novel and create things for their followers to do, I mean, they wouldn't be leaders, or not successful ones anyway.
I think in a sense like that, Zira touched on it, the need for entertainment and fun is a vital drive in the context of the game. If you're not providing that for your people, you're somewhat in jeopardy of your leadership position, I would think.
Someone like Chairman Mao, for example. So Mao Zedong, not a nice man in many ways, but he was an absolutely remarkable leader, you know, and he was a very skillful communicator. So, for example, he literally wrote poetry. So he went on the Long March, for example, where 90% of the troops that went on the Long March, where he was pursued across thousands of miles over many, many months, brutal, chasing by the then nationalist forces. It was a communist leader. And he went into that as just one leader amongst many, and he ended up as the leading, the communist leader. And he then went on to, end up like leading China. And he was a brilliant communicator. He would stir up, like you talk about that. So he stirred up something called the Cultural Revolution. And that Cultural Revolution was literally about trying to change the very structure of society.
Our final question for you, Nick. This is a key pitch in your book, and I think it is a topic that all of our listeners, whether they're leading groups or not leading groups, are going to be keenly interested in because it's very, very applicable for us. Once we're in a war, how do we actually win it, and how do you prevent your group from losing it?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how you operate in your world, but I mean, I think there are. So I would say, so in the real world, and obviously I spend time I was in the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago. I spend a lot of time with people I enormously respect in the American and British militaries. So I think there's no one simple answer. I think that actually, as I was saying right at the beginning, the brain is like an orchestra, right? There are many different brain systems, and we need to use all of that orchestra of our brain in order to create the symphony with which we live our life, and we need to harness all those different things in order to win. So to give you an example, you talked about the will to fight, and that's absolutely central. How can we enhance the will to fight? So some of the things will be things like emotion regulation. So, and there are techniques you can do for that, like reappraising situations, and suppressing your emotions can be helpful, and so on. Having good sleep can also be useful, so you can regulate your emotions. Another critical thing is training. So I don't know how the degree. I mean, do you guys train?
Absolutely.
Some groups do, some groups don't. I would say most of the more serious militaries do invest at least somewhat in either upskilling new members or practicing more advanced concepts with their existing people, even if it's perhaps informally.
So training is crucial. So, and just to say that there's training that's simpler training, and this is just about the fact that, so one of the reasons why the French lost in, I'm not anti-French here, returning to the beginning, the French won World War I, fought for years in World War I and won World War I, but then, they lost in World War II within less than 7 weeks, right, of the start of the German offensive. France had collapsed completely. And one of the key reasons for that is that there was a part of the front that the French were manning, and they just simply had their most poorly trained troops there. They were very poorly trained troops. And when you are poorly trained, the shock and surprise of German panzer divisions coming at you in that thing, and I don't know what it will be exactly in your game, that is just, instead of it being something where you can cope with that and then fight back, instead of that, you become paralyzed. So training so that you can react appropriately in novel situations, that's really important. And so someone like George C. Marshall, who was like the top American military commander in World War II, 10 years before World War II, he actually ran the infantry training school at Fort Benning. And George C. Marshall radically changed how American military training was done. And in particular, so 200 future generals went through Fort Benning as instructors or students whilst he was there. Some of those things were basically making sure that students were trained in many different environments, and also doing a thing where he reduced the class sizes so people would teach. That there would be smaller classes, so you would then have more intensive learning, but then you would have to then go on and then teach that to other people, because that teaching learning spiral is really important for humans. And then I just say another thing, obviously there are loads of different things, and then we can go all the way through to the very final, like the most sophisticated parts of how we can plan, for example. So one of the things here I would say is about wisdom, so as opposed to just cleverness. So we do need creativity, and boredom is actually a useful thing in making us more creative, but I don't have time to go into that. But cleverness is very important, coming up with clever plans, but wisdom is even more important for winning wars, right? So, and that requires metacognition, or thinking about our own thinking, which is something that I know you raised earlier. And we can enhance our own metacognition, and you can enhance your own metacognition. And that means asking about your own weaknesses, right? Choosing working together as a team. So Winston Churchill, for example, chose as his top military advisor. He chose as his top military advisor somebody who would argue with him deliberately, right? Not like pointlessly argue, but, would push back and critique what he was going to say. Churchill would expound his ideas. Another good idea, another good way of reflect on your own ideas is to write your ideas down. And another thing, of course, is sometimes to say, and again, this sounds very like, something that everyone would say in a big organization, but it's really important, is to say, am I, like, interrogate your goal, lift your eyes. What are we really trying to achieve here? And so one of the things that Churchill did is he really valued time to reflect. Sometimes for him, it would be on a ship as he traveled to America, for example, but he really valued time to reflect and think. That's not all you have to do, but that's another thing that can take you from just being a good leader into being a great leader.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely underrated step in the planning process. A lot of people get trapped into pursuing a very short-term goal or a very fixed on one strategy. Don't really think about what I'm actually trying to achieve, and thus, is this the right way to do it? Is it even the right goal to shoot for?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And, a very finite resource in EVE that I think Alliance leaders understand very well, but people that are just getting into that side of the game don't quite understand as much, is your players' time and their attention and their emotional investment are actually finite resources, and you've got to be careful with what you spend it on.
Which is very similar to, so in fact, towards the end of the book, and one of the things I say in the book is, that one of my favorite quotes, and unfortunately on the internet now, you discover that every quote is apocryphal and no one actually said it, unfortunately, but it's one, I hope it's true, that Oscar Wilde, the famous wit Oscar Wilde said, the problem with socialism is that it takes up too many evenings. And I just think that's the same with most things. Like, most people have a lot going on in their lives. Like, I think war is really important, but, I'm going to go off now and do Halloween-related activities. That's the reality of the thing. And we need to remember that that's a really great way of putting it. And at every level, people's attention and interest is always going to be limited. And that doesn't mean they're lazy. It just means they're human.
That's an incredible quote. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. And we are going to close it with that. The book is Warhead by Dr. Nicholas Wright. It is now available in the US, the UK, and probably whatever country you're listening this to, and in wherever you pick up your books. Amazon bookstores, if anyone still remembers what those are like. Head out and get it. It's a fascinating read. We're going to close out the show with some highlights and shout-outs really quickly, because I know it's a bit of a long one. Hopefully you enjoyed this discussion. Very quickly, I had the most exciting 5 minutes of my EVE life in the most recent couple times I've been playing. Using a Thanatos, which is a EVE carrier, about to get buffed, hopefully meaningfully, but I still like to keep up practice, and so I was looking for an excuse to drop it, and we had been looking for about an hour or so, maybe a little bit more, and I would have shot anything. So when my scout, who was the first time, using a recon to drop a cap on anything, first time hunter killing, he said, "Hey, I've got an Osprey, and it's sitting on a Metanox drill." "Oh, cool, it's probably repairing said drill." I didn't ask enough questions. And I really should have asked him, "Hey," I think I asked him, "whose drill is it?" He's told me Big Ab. I said, "Oh, that's great. And it's just the one Osprey." I should have asked him how many other Big Ab were in system. And had he noticed any people in local that were known to also fly hunter killers that we might have to worry about. So I sort of blind jumped a carrier against one of the most prolific anti-capital ship killing alliances in the game. We killed the Osprey almost immediately. And then I realized where I was and who was around me. And proceeded to freak the F out. And so I immediately tried to warp to the nearest gate and get myself out of there. As soon as I landed, there was a rapier that was ready to jump through the gate with me. I'm like, oh shit. Okay. I had made myself a little mini bookmark in between the gate and the drill, just in case this kind of thing happened. So I warped back to it. Combat probes were dropped as soon as I went in to warp. I'm like, oh shit, okay, I'm probably gonna die. At that point, I had resigned myself to losing this very expensive ship. As I landed, the rapier did appear, but he appeared 75 kilometers off of me, so I tried to warp back to the gate, figured that'd be my only shot. I made it. The rapier, for whatever reason, did not immediately follow me. As I jumped through, it was reported clear on the other side by my director and my shout-out for the day, Ikeo. Caleb got me into this, and Ikeo helped get me out of it. I jumped to the other side. A pilgrim was there, decloaked. It did point and scram the carrier. Did not, for whatever reason, light its sign-in field to bring in its fleet. Instead, Ikeo came and pushed it off to the point that I could... I was still pointed, but I wasn't scrammed. So I hit my brand new carrier micro jump drive and blinked away from the Pilgrim. It didn't have combat probes out, so I was pretty safe. Ikeo kept him locked down while I tried to warp away to a station. As I'm warping, and it's taking forever, for whatever reason, taking longer than normal, the rapier that had chased me through the other system finally realized where I'd went. He jumped in. I guess noted that I was further away. He popped his probes out. As I saw the probes leaving and getting into position to scan me down, I finally warped away. I was probably about 2 seconds away from getting tackled again. Would have been a very ignominious way to lose one of my oldest carriers, but I managed to escape with my life and a kill mail under my belt, just by the skin of my teeth. So shout out to Caleb once again for getting me into that fire, and for Ikeo for bailing me out of that fire. Much appreciated, guys. Zero?
Well, I very much enjoyed watching the Tuskers win the Alliance tournament, and I enjoyed even more, and this transitions to the shout out, reading the AAR, especially the part where I saw one of the best compliments I've ever seen one EVE player bestow upon another, which is that Scorched Celeste being accused of playing Dota during the AT finals on a second screen while being Logi for the Tuskers. I think that's a fantastic compliment, and I did ask Scorch if this was true or not. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm not going to tell you what he said, but yeah, I enjoyed that discussion.
I'd like to believe that is true. Nick, do you have any shout-outs?
Wow. I'm operating just in the normal world, so I have nothing anywhere near as exciting as that. I guess in the last month, the most exciting thing that genuinely has happened is that I have published this is the first book for a general audience I've ever published. And that is extremely exciting. It's something that I've been working towards for many years. I've published other academic books, and this is the first book that I've written for a general audience. So I'd say that was the most exciting thing, actually. You know, it's seeing something, I guess this is something from the way you've been describing your world, it's something where you can create something, you can imagine it in your mind. There was a point, 4 or 5 years ago where this was just an idea, and then you can see it come to fruition, and then you're literally there, talking. In that case, I did the launch event in Washington, DC, in the British Embassy there, with one of the people from the Washington Post and all this stuff, and in conversation with lots of people. And it's just enormously exciting seeing something you've created, from your mind happening there in the world. And I guess you guys see this a lot with the things that you create in your world. And it genuinely sounds really fascinating.
I mean, we're sitting in one of those for me, launching this podcast, and I couldn't imagine how big it's grown. Over 10,000 listens a month, sometimes over 10,000 an episode. That's pretty crazy. And
it is. I mean,
but it's never got me to the British Embassy. So
no. Well, I mean, there we go. Next time I go, I don't know where you are in the world, but we can see. But this is one of the things we do as humans. I have friends who start companies, other people who do all, artists, whatever. As you said, podcasts. You there's nothing, and then you create something, and that is really just remarkable about us humans. We like creating these things, stimulating them in our minds, and then turning them into something that's really out there. It's very exciting.
Absolutely. And as you might have noticed, audience, there's a lot of exciting things that have gone on in the game that we're not talking about. The Alliance tournament, there's a new expansion. Noir has been on some contracts. We have a few military campaigns to talk about. There's just general war and politics updates. There are a lot of things are happening around the server from the big coalitions and the smaller coalitions that need a chat. We will talk about all of this. Noir Academy has just rebranded into Noir Militia, speaking of training. That's the arm of our training group. We will get to all of that on the next episode, which will be back to our normal format, but we couldn't pass up the opportunity to get Nick on the show with us. But we still want to thank our Golden Elite sponsors. You guys have been an integral part of keeping this podcast going and giving us the great production qualities that we currently enjoy. So thank you to Mark Havoc, Wayne Downey, Tweak, Braille Trays, Jeff, The Great Nib, Sergeant Felix, Justin Ionin, Spencer, and our this will be her first episode, our very newest member of the Golden Elite, Maggie. Thank you very much for your continued support. Don't forget to vote in the CSM elections. The elections are live right now. The ballot that we highly suggest you follow is on the site, declarationsofwar.com. Go check it out. If you're not sure, you can hear from the candidates that many of which appear on that ballot, appear on our episodes. We had candidate panels. Go check those out. We have one for incumbents and one for challengers. But as far as this episode, that is it, guys. Leave a comment on the episode. Vote in our poll. Noir recruitment is open. If you would like to deny people's vital interests and cause a lot of discord in their organizations and make them turn on each other, this is it for you. This is PvP with a purpose in EVE. Join Noir, come on the contracts with us, and see if it's right for you. Chillax on our Discord. You can ask us all sorts of questions. If you have contracts you'd like Noir to go on, reach out to me. We're about to start a long-term deployment this coming weekend. I can't wait to tell you about it on an upcoming episode. But I kind of wish you were there to experience it firsthand. So join the Discord. Link will be in the description of this episode. You can also find it on the website and in-game at Cafe Noir channel. That's CAFE space NOIR dot. Wherever you are, whoever you're flying with, good hunting, listeners.